Alright guys, welcome back to Still Horse History Adventures. Today's topic is going to be one of those topics that is going to bring up some strong feelings. It's going to have a little bit of controversy to it. I do want to go ahead and throw out that disclaimer as I did in the introduction video for the channel to begin with. There are times where I'm going to have to cover some of these hard subjects. It doesn't mean that I agree with the actions of the people who committed these atrocities. It just means that I'm covering it and I'm trying to bring to you the most factually based way of putting this subject that I possibly can. So obviously today's subject is going to be really the introduction into a series of videos that I plan to do for Black History Month. Now, I am a big proponent for sharing Black history throughout the entire year, not just in the month of February. But since this is the first February the channel's going through, I'm going to try my best to focus heavily on Black history this month. It's just kind of an introduction into some of that, and then continue to cover more Black history throughout the year, not just in this month. But as unfortunate as it is, slavery is obviously the building blocks for Black history in the United States. We're in the low country of South Carolina here. This is where plantations were everywhere. Slavery existed all throughout this area, and I can't even put a percentage into how much of the culture, how much of society, and how much of the history of this area is heavily inspired by and contributed to by the African American community of this area, their ancestors, from the first that arrived on the ships to people who were born here today. Their culture continues to influence much of South Carolina history and much of South Carolina culture as a whole. So I'm going to get into that. Obviously, I'm going to talk about slavery's origins. I'm going to talk about it coming here to America and the after effect of all of that. So bear with me through this tough subject, guys. I do think it really needs to be talked about, especially as we enter into a series on Black history. We need to acknowledge the origin stories of where these men and women originally come from, how they end up here, and the negative effects of all of that as well. But if you guys are enjoying the content in the channel so far, please make sure you're hitting that like and that subscribe button. If you hit the little like, it really helps me out to see which videos are getting more feedback, which ones are not. Additionally, helps with the YouTube's analytics in some way. And also that subscribe button, man. There is nothing more important that you guys could do for me than hit that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. We're already building the channel, but I've got a ways to go, and that would really help me out. If you have friends that you believe would enjoy this channel, feel free to share it, guys. Really appreciate all the people who come back and watch these videos and everything that you guys have helped me do thus far. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into the ride. You're going to notice that this video is more of kind of a moto vlog sort of style, as it's basically just going to be me talking while you can see me riding. All right, let's get to it. So to really start off the topic of slavery and where it came from, I sort of feel like we need to dive back a little bit into ancient history. We're talking about slavery as a whole in human history has existed for about as long as humanity has existed on this planet. The desire to get someone else to do the work for you and you not pay them anything, unfortunately, has been part of human tendency throughout our history. Now, we dive back to the very earliest records of slavery. We can really see that early humans were doing it. There is some record to say that even as early as like the first Homo sapiens and maybe some of the Neanderthals and people like that were all using slavery to their benefit. Now, when we really think about ancient slavery, most people are going to jump to the Roman, Greek, early Europe, and Egypt as some of the points for slavery. Obviously, as the Roman and the Greek empires were expanding, territories they were taking over, they were capturing people from the local tribes and from the local clans. They were enslaving them, forcing them to build roads, forcing them to build things for the empire, just all around treating them as less than a Roman or Greek citizen. They would ship some of them back further into the Roman and the Greek empires. And we see this happen a lot to the Germanic tribes. We see it happen to the Celtic tribes and the Scandinavian tribes as the Romans will push further and further through Eastern Europe and then over into Western Europe as well. Also notable, the Egyptian slavery. There's been many accounts of it, some biblical accounts of it. We do believe that most likely the pyramids and some of the great structures in Egypt were built predominantly by slaves under the direction of Egyptian engineers. But if we're really trying to get into African history regarding slavery and the origins of slavery as we are thinking about it as it pertains to American slavery, that's really going to start around the 1400s when Africa is having tribal wars, especially throughout the areas of West Africa. Now, those tribal wars are going to cause it to where these different African tribes who are coming out on top are enslaving some of the members of the other tribes. Now, there's always arguments back and forth what style of slavery that was. Was it the same style of slavery that we see in America later on? Was it a quote-unquote kinder, gentler slavery? The way I'm seeing this, honestly, is there is no kinder, gentler slavery. If you're forced to lose your freedom and to work for someone else, no matter how you draw that line, it is something terrible to do to another human being. But the African tribes who are enslaving these other African tribes, many of them are now taking them to the coast where Portugal has worked to deal with them to begin purchasing some of these slaves. Now they're going to take them back up to the Portuguese plantations, some other places that Portugal has economic influence into, and they're going to work for the Portuguese. Around 1502 or so, Spain gets involved in this as well, and we start seeing a rise in demand. Now, the reason this is important is because these West African tribes who have began selling to Portugal are now going to start selling to Spain as well. And with the rise in demand, they're no longer just selling people who they have captured through war efforts. They're actually intentionally going into the interior of Africa to round up lesser tribes, bring them to the coastline, and sell them to these Europeans. Now, I know we're looking to get into the England and France involvement of this, as that's going to obviously go into the American history for it. But England and France doesn't really get involved until almost the 1600s. Believe it or not, the Dutch actually get involved in about the mid-1500s or so. And by the 1600s, the Dutch are actually going to end up being the foremost slave traders in the world. They're going to be taking slaves over to the Caribbean. They're going to be taking slaves to South America. They're going to be taking slaves back to Europe. Anywhere that they can transport slaves, they're going to do that. Now, the transatlantic slave trade as a whole was really just one part of a triangular trade system. What they would do is they would take goods and crops and raw materials from the plantations in South America, the Caribbean, and North America, and they would take those over to Europe, turn them into textiles and other goods, take those down to Africa, and use those goods to trade for slaves. Obviously picking the slaves up, taking them back to the plantations throughout South America, the Caribbean, and North America, and the cycle continues. Now, the slave trade as a whole, at least what we consider the transatlantic slave trade, is predominantly going to run in its full force from about the 1520s up through the 1800s. We're looking at a time period where about an estimate of 12.5 million people from Africa are displaced around the world against their will. Out of that 12.5 million, about 2 million or so are estimated to have not survived the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. So that leaves us about 10.5 million who are actually being brought to South America, the Caribbean, and North America. And out of that, going to North America, what we consider modern-day United States, we're only looking at about 388,000 to 400,000 people. Now, the reason I make this distinction is because it's showing that North America as a whole isn't the only place where the slavery was existing. In fact, the majority of those taken from Africa were actually taken to South America and to the Caribbean. So when you do the percentages, about 3% of all those taken from Africa were directly shipped to the modern-day United States, meaning that they were intended to go to that area. And then about an additional 2% would indirectly end up in what is now the United States, coming from the Caribbean or through South America channels. So in total, about 5% of those taken from Africa will be displaced and relocated to the modern-day United States. And again, the Caribbean and South America taking the majority of those men and women. Now, the style of people that they're taking from Africa are not going to be anybody who's sickly, anybody who's disabled, anyone elderly. Typically, they're looking for women who are in their childbearing years. They're looking for young men who are of the age where they would begin looking to start a family. And of course, they're taking some of the healthiest children that they can take. When they get those men and women to their final destination, their idea is to be able to start this chattel slavery, where they're producing more slaves by the slaves who they've brought here, who are inherently going to be attracted to one another. They're going to form their own romances. They're going to form their own families. And in some cases, they're going to have children. Now, the object here, obviously, is wait for those children to be born. They rip the children from the parents. They sell them off as slaves as well. And in some cases, the children would work on the same plantation as the parent. But oftentimes, you're looking at them kind of continuing slavery, and that's really what chattel slavery is. Now, early colonial America obviously founded heavily on slavery, especially when you talk about a colony such as South Carolina. Now, South Carolina's origin really goes back to 1670, when the sons and daughters of Barbados plantation owners are arriving here, as 8 lords of England have offered free land or a land grab if they arrive in the new Carolina colony. They set up Charlestown, and if you want a little bit more in-depth of how that happens, one of my early videos about Charlestown landing kind of describes it a little bit more, but we don't have time to get into that and to cover all of the subjects that I'm wanting to cover with this video in particular. So, colonial America, very heavily influenced by slavery, especially in the southern states. If you look to where the Mason-Dixon line would end up later on, kind of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, they're going to be the border right there for the Mason-Dixon line. So everything south of that is going to be very heavily influenced by slavery, as this is where the plantations are going to exist. That doesn't mean that those in the northeastern colonies were not participating in slavery in some way. Many of them, in fact, were participating in slavery. They were participating by being the merchants who go and get the goods, take them to Europe, and then go back down to Africa, pick up some of the slaves, and bring them back here. There are a couple who would move to Charleston, such as Nathaniel Russell, who would do that. He was originally from Rhode Island. So it's not that people in the Northeast weren't involved at all. Some of them were. It just wasn't as prevalent in that area as it would be in the southern states. Now, if we continue up until early America, talking about the Revolutionary time period, discussions about ending the transatlantic slave trade for American involvement are already going on at the time of the Revolutionary War. In the years after the Revolutionary War, we see that it's one of the topics of debate that is coming up into early American government. They're going to hold off, though, until 1808 to actually abolish the transatlantic slave trade. The Compromise of 1808 was actually what does that. Now, it doesn't mean that there were no more people brought from Africa into America. They were just done so illegally. They were smuggled in, a lot of times by Caribbean merchants. They'd be smuggled in several times. The U.S. Navy, as it would stand, in small numbers, would end up intercepting some of these illegal slave trade ships. England also, throughout the 1800s and moving into the early 1900s, were very adamant about potentially catching any slave trade that may be going anywhere throughout the world. Obviously, it had already ended in America by 1865 completely, and Brazil is considered the last modern country to have officially ended slavery. They officially ended in 1888. So after that, you don't really see anybody being caught, especially like I just said, going into the 1900s. But there's still going to be some vigilance to make sure that it doesn't happen, right? Now, when we talk about America ending slavery, obviously one of the groups that comes into mind is the Abolitionist movement. Now, at the end of the 1700s, the Abolitionist movement was already sort of getting a foothold with the discussions about ending America's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. They also wanted to push it further and say that slavery in America needed to end altogether. And part of what keeps slavery going was honestly Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s. That makes cotton profitable, it makes slavery profitable, and you're going to see a rise in demand for slavery. So they're not going to end it in the 1790s, they're going to continue until 1808, and slavery as a whole is not going to end by that compromise of 1808. Alright, so I got to get gas real quick. I actually left the house with over 100 miles since I last filled up, and on a 1200 Sportster with only a 3.3 gallon tank, I'm only going to make it anywhere from 120 to 130, 140 miles depending on my gas mileage. So I know the video here is just seamless for you guys, so we'll head back out of the gas station and kind of get back to it. So as I was saying, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin is really going to cause a resurgence in slavery, and we're not going to see slavery end as a whole in 1808 as originally thought. Instead, we're just going to see the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, as we're moving into the 1820s and 1830s, we will see the abolitionist movement growing at this point. We're going to see Reverend John Bachman of Charleston release what he will call scientific evidence that white people and black people are indeed the exact same species as one another, and he determined all that really through studying the different species of birds in a collaboration he had done with J.J. Audubon in categorizing the North American select species of birds. He also went on to write a book called The Unity of the Human Race. This time frame, we're also going to see other famed abolitionists rise up, such as Sarah and Angelina Grimke of Charleston, Theodore Dwight Weld up in the Northeast, who actually ended up marrying Angelina Grimke. He will write a book called American Slavery as It Is, and it's really just a collection of stories from escaped slaves and freedmen who had come to the North, talking about their life of slavery and the escape process. We also see the famous Harriet Beecher Stowe story come out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and all of this is really just going to help boost the abolitionist movement. Now, the abolitionists obviously wanted a complete and total annihilation of the institution of slavery, and they didn't really want to settle for anything less. Now, we move into the famous election of 1860, the rise of Abraham Lincoln into the public eye as a presidential candidate. And there's a lot of misconception here about Abraham Lincoln's statements leading into his election. Abraham Lincoln at no point during his campaigning ever threatens to end slavery, nor does he ever take a direct support of the abolitionist movement, even though he likely agreed with most of their stance. Abraham Lincoln actually just says that slavery where it exists may persist, but the introduction of a new slave state within his tenure will not occur. So it's not that he's necessarily wanting to end slavery at the time. It was a bit of a radical idea moving into 1860. What he really wanted was the halting of the expansion of slavery. America is looking to start new states out in the West at that point. We've already seen places such as Missouri pop up, and they're not wanting to continue to introduce these new states as slave states or agricultural states. Instead, they're wanting to be free of slavery, so they're free states, and that's going to really kind of cause more of an industrial economy of those areas, is where if they're going to be predominantly agricultural, they're probably going to be using slavery at a time in which slavery is still legal. So that's really his big point, is he doesn't want the expansion of slavery to continue, but where it already exists, he's kind of tolerating it at the time. Now, obviously the South still views this as a direct violation of states' rights. They view them as a threat to states' rights and a threat to slavery and their way of life, as they will say in their ordinances of secession. So it's not that the South isn't seceding over the idea or the perceived threat of ending slavery. That is a very big topic into why they are seceding. They've got a other list of reasons of why they're seceding too, and of course states' rights being at the foremost of those arguments. But states' rights kind of encompass everything from their economy all the way through slavery, and pretty much every bit of argument they have, they're going to rely on states' rights being the main portion of the argument. Now, as the American Civil War begins, the beginning of the war had very little to do with the idea of ending slavery. Even men such as Ulysses S. Grant, who, by the way, was married to a slave owner named Julia Dent of Missouri, he didn't necessarily agree with slavery himself. His father had been an abolitionist. He was raised to be an abolitionist, but he did tolerate it with Julia Dent and her family. Now, at the beginning of the war, even Grant says that ending slavery as an institution was unfeasible, and he feared would cause much more backlash than what they were ready for. As we progress through the war, though, his idea on that changes, as well as Abraham Lincoln's idea upon that changing. If anybody didn't know, Mary Todd Lincoln's family was also a slave-owning family. So these men had married into slave-owning families even though they themselves did not agree with it. And as I said, as we progress through the Civil War, their mindset on this becomes a little bit more of what they would consider radicalized at the time, where they're going to start becoming more on board with the abolitionist movement. So about halfway through the war, they have embraced the abolitionist movement, and really the Emancipation Proclamation is the point in time in which we see America switch the American Civil War directly into a war to end slavery. There's a couple ways that this happens. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation said that slaves in the rebel states were now set free, but didn't really do anything to set free the slaves that were not in the rebel states, as there were several border states that had aligned themselves officially with the Union, but the state itself was not a rebel state, even though it still had slavery in it. Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky being the top three of that. So it does very little to end slavery itself. Obviously, if they're ending slavery in the South is its own country at the time and isn't recognizing or acknowledging the order of Abraham Lincoln. What the Emancipation Proclamation does do, though, is allow for African Americans to take up arms and fight in the American Civil War. Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts will see this as an opportunity to create an all-African American unit to fight for abolishment of slavery in the war. Now, he was fearful that if he took freed slaves and put them in this unit, that they would cower in the faces of their former masters. So he really sought out men who had been born as freed men. Obviously, Frederick Douglass is going to get heavily involved in this as well, and two of his sons would serve in what would become known as the 54th Massachusetts. In my opinion, the 54th Massachusetts is one of the biggest reasons that slavery actually does end, and that the war becomes truly a war to end slavery. They were really, at their time of their conception, the only unit in the American military that was totally dedicated to the idea of abolition. So, free black men fought for the freedoms of other black people in this country. If you were to blanket statement the American Civil War and call it a war to end slavery from the very start, in my opinion, you were completely removing the importance of the 54th Massachusetts. You're removing the importance of their sacrifice. So I like to make sure that we include that with it. Ultimately, with the end of the American Civil War, though, slavery was still technically legal up until December 6, 1865. Now, individual states had already started making it illegal. Obviously, many of the northern states had previously made it illegal, but even some of the southern states are starting to abolish it because they recognize at this point it's going to end. So on December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment is finally passed, and slavery in America is finally over. Well, now that slavery was officially over, you would think that things would get a lot better for the African American community, and for about the first decade, it really did look like it was going to be. Men such as Robert Smalls, a former slave from South Carolina, who had really aided the Union during the American Civil War after his capture of the ship the Planter. He would end up in American government and part of the Black Congress. Other men such as Frederick Douglass, later on Booker T. Washington, people of that nature, George Washington Carver, would all be American advisors for the African American community to the United States government. Unfortunately, a decade or so after the American Civil War, the Jim Crow laws go into effect, and we will see those begin the trend of institutional racism from the American government toward the black community that will continuously hold them back in society. World War I came around. Americans were called to service, not only the white Americans, but black Americans too. And after the war, when they were returning home with PTSD, the handling of black veterans after the war was very disproportionate to the way that the white veterans were being handled. If they both walked out into a yard waving guns in the air and shooting, thinking they were back in the war, black veteran would be more likely to be arrested, while the white veteran would be more likely to be viewed with sympathy due to the atrocities that he had witnessed. Now, obviously through civil rights, they will fight for equality in America, and for the most part, civil rights will deliver equality to African Americans. However, the damage was done. There's still lingering effects of slavery and still lingering effects of the Jim Crow laws that are visible in America today. Now, as you can guess, this is a pretty hard subject to tackle, especially when it brings on so many strong feelings from many people, and additionally brings on a lot of controversy. But I'm hoping that all in all, I was able to give at least somewhat of a brief understanding of American slavery, the way that it was formed, the history that existed prior to it with slavery, all the way up through our colonial period, up into early United States, and then a post-Civil War time frame and a little bit of understanding of post-Civil War happenings. This by far is not going to conclude African American history on this channel. February will not conclude African American history on this channel, but as I've said in the introduction, I really wanted to start at the very origins of African American history, and I debated back and forth on whether or not to do this video. But I hope you guys can listen to this with understanding. I hope you learned something, and if you do have any contributions that you would like to add to me that maybe I can add in a future video, send me an email with all of that. But as always, guys, make sure you check twice, save a life, and you guys take care of each other. Stay tuned for future episodes coming up this month, and make sure you're hitting that like and that subscribe button. Thanks again, and thank y'all for joining me for an account of slavery with Still Horse History Adventures.